Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming this evening. I'm Adif, I'm the Academic Director here at the Cambridge University College. We're very pleased to welcome Shaykh Musa Furber here to the college to speak today on something that he's been working on as a research fellow at the Tabah Foundation, a topic on future generations. What does Islam say about one's responsibility towards future generations? He himself has studied linguistics at Portland State University, and then after that went to study in Damascus at the Mahad al-Tahdib wa Ta'lib, and then at the Dar al-Ifta in Cairo with Shaykh Ali Juma, where he studied as well under Shaykh Ali Juma, and then after that he has been working at the Tabah Foundation in Abu Dhabi with Habib Ali Jeffrey. So, alhamdulillah, he has mashallah, very experienced record behind him and a long period of research in Islamic issues, and one of the things he's been looking at is the issue of Islam's responsibility, or Muslims' views towards one's responsibility towards future generations. So, alhamdulillah, to your choice.
Assalamu alaikum. Since the 1970s, the topic of ethical obligations to future generations has been of interest to philosophers, economists, environmentalists, and others. While the context for application differs for each field, the central issues are the same: whether a current generation has moral obligations to non-contemporaneous future generations, the nature of those obligations, and whether those obligations require an earlier generation to make sacrifices for a future generation. For example, does the present generation have the right to exhaust the planet's resources to render the planet uninhabitable? Do future generations have rights which require the present generation to conserve resources and preserve the environment for future generations? Are there institutions that must be built and passed on? At the heart of the matter is the saving, creation, and distribution of assets and resources. Thus far, the concept of ethical obligations to future generations has been applied primarily in economic and environmental contexts, though it is also relevant to social assets such as culture, institutions, and knowledge. My paper is divided into 3 sections. The first section introduces the concept of obligations to future generations and its importance as a tool for ethical reasoning, testing ethical systems, and for policy making. The second presents a summary of how contemporary Muslim authors have dealt with the notion of such obligations, and the third lays the groundwork for Sharia-based framework for addressing them. The paper is exploratory in nature, and as such, it does not intend to be exhaustive, but rather aims to introduce a topic and offer preliminary justifications and evidence that will serve as a foundation for further studies. Just a quick overview of what we're going to do is, first we're going to discuss the basic idea of what are future generations. The literature on this is huge. Thousands and thousands of pages. And there's tons of theories that have been mentioned about it, ethical theories, and we're only going to have like 10 minutes. So it's going to be very, very short. The contemporary Muslim authors and future generations will talk about one example of how it's been written about. A little bit of modern Sharia reflection, which is going to be the majority of things. We're going to look at, are obligations to future generations actually significant in the Sharia? It's a question that has to be asked, and we have to find an answer. What are the general Sharia tools for thinking about future generations? Is there anything that already exists that we can use? Developing a framework for discussing future generations, the proposed content of the obligation, 3 issues of special consideration, a small conclusion, and then question and answer. Obligations to future generations examines moral issues concerning persons who have yet to be born, but may come into existence. The question it examines include whether future persons are morally significant, whether they have a right to exist, whether we are required to make certain sacrifices for the sake of their welfare, whether concern for future persons can abrogate moral obligations to existing persons, and what sorts of resources and institutions we are obliged to pass on to them. Philosophical concerns for future generations go back to at least Aristotle's theory of distributive justice, which he introduced in Nicomachean Ethics. In contemporary literature, obligations to future generations are often included within discussions on intergenerational justice, which concerns moral obligations that presently existing moral agents owe to non-contemporaneous past and future generations, and as such, it is also present in ever increasingly important topics of the environment, ecology, and sustainability. When we're talking about these non-contemporaneous generations, what we're trying to do is ask the question whether or not the people who are alive today, for example, are going to owe anything to humans who they will never meet. So we're not talking about obligations to children, and we're not talking about obligations to grandchildren, because chances are you're going to meet them. We're talking about obligations to human beings you would never encounter because they're going to be born after you're dead. So there's this big distance before them, and we're looking at non-overlapping groups of people. The topic of obligations to future generations remained largely overlooked until recently. The most popular explanation for the recent interest is that previous generations lacked the capacity to render extinct or critically impair future generations of man or beast, or to greatly deprive them of resources or well-being. Prior to the 20th century, we couldn't just blow up the entire world, whereas during the Cold War, we suddenly had this ability to do. Technology and population have advanced to where decisions of today result in irreversible damages or changes which will be passed on to persons who are not yet born and did not have any say in the matter. These decisions not only affect the quality of life of future generations, but may also put their very existence at risk. The concept of obligations to future generations has been used repeatedly in the context of economic and environmental policy. For example, in 1997, UNESCO adopted its declaration on the responsibilities of the present generation towards future generations, and the authors listed these responsibilities in a set of 12 articles. So we mentioned that there's these obligations. Let's get an idea of what some people have said they are. So UNESCO in this document said, these obligations include the needs and interests of future generations, the freedom of choice, maintenance and perpetuation of humankind, preservation of life on earth, protection of the environment, the human genome and biodiversity, cultural diversity and cultural heritage, common heritage of mankind, peace, development and education, non-discrimination and implementation. A moral obligation to future generations needs to clarify who owes what to whom, why this is the case, and how to handle dilemmas. Leaving obligations to future generations in vague and ambiguous terms runs the risk of policymakers adopting a policy of either extreme preservation or extreme consumption. According to a policy of extreme preservation, present generations minimize consumption in order to save resources for future generations. So they starve themselves today so that people in the future will have plenty. This is in contrast to a policy of extreme consumption where present generations maximize consumption in order to maximize wealth, either because they do not consider the needs of future generations significant, or because they consider this the best way to build wealth for future generations. This last point it's pretty obvious, but let me kind of restate it. Our resource usage today could make the future actually better. We might use resources today that are non-renewable, but by using them, we can put future generations into a position where they wouldn't need to use them at all. And so, on this view, that wouldn't be considered necessarily a bad thing. Several contemporary Muslim authors have alluded to the concept of obligations to future generations in their writings, though none of the writings surveyed have provided compelling proof for such an obligation from within the Sharia itself. Perhaps the best example is environmental protection in Islam, and in the references of the thing I passed out to you, you can get to all of its bibliographic information, whose authors make explicit reference to obligations to future generations to show that the Sharia endorses an obligation to protect the environment. They justify the existence of such an obligation through two arguments. one based upon textual evidence, and another based upon obtaining universal common good for all created beings, masalih. The authors explain that humankind has a special relationship to the rest of creation, and that Allah has entrusted them with stewardship, with khilafah, on the earth, and that this stewardship includes duties that are intergenerational as well as interspecific. So both they cross generations and they also cross species. So humans owe things to dolphins, we owe things to other created beings. This is their claim. The authors cite the 10th verse of the 41st surah of the Quran, and He has set within it mountains standing firm, and blessed it, and ordained it in its diverse sustenance in 4 days, alike for all who seek. But this verse is in the form of a declarative sentence. Notice it says, and He has set down, and also alike for all to seek. This is a declaration. It's a statement of fact. It's not an imperative. So this verse is in the form of a declarative sentence, informing us that Allah Most High has already decreed sustenance for those who seek it, rather than an imperative. So in itself, the verse does not bear legal or ethical import. It's a statement of fact. It doesn't tell us to go do something or to cease from doing something. And moreover, they have not provided evidence to warrant their treating the declarative as an imperative. If they brought this evidence, we would submit. It's been turned from a declarative into an imperative, but no explanation was given why they treated the part of it alike for all to seek, and the entire verse as a command to us to make sure that they have it. And as for obtaining universal common good for all created beings, the authors write that universal common good encompasses both our immediate welfare in the present and our ultimate welfare in the hereafter. This objective of universal common good is a distinct characteristic of Islamic law. It means that no species or generation may be excluded from consideration in the course of planning and administration, but that each individual Muslim, as well as a Muslim community, must honestly strive towards the welfare of the whole. Unfortunately, there are several problems which prevent this approach from providing practical advice concerning obligations to future generations. Perhaps the most immediate problem is that no generation knows how many creatures currently exist or will exist in the future and when they will exist. So there's no way to avoid excluding a species or generation from one's consideration during planning or administration, so each generation will be limited to using whatever resources are necessary to meet only its various necessities in order to avoid starving the unknown number of future generations. Is this clear or not clear? See, I've read this so many times, it's on. Alright. If we have 100 units of food, and we have 40 people in this room, and we don't know how many people are coming after us, what we can do is we can eat 40 units of food, the bare minimum necessary to survive, and we're going to have to preserve the rest for everyone else. Okay? If we say it's obligatory for us to make sure that they can live. Now here, we have 100 units of food, 40 people in the room, and all of these people that are coming. Because we don't know how many people are coming, we can only eat the bare minimum that we need in order to survive. How many people are coming? What if only one person comes after us? We just wasted, 59 units of food. So we're going to live caveman style, and then this one guy that comes after us is going to end up living in luxury. So this is a difficulty with their idea of obtaining universal good, because if we take everything down to bare minimums, then that means we're going to have to plan for an unknown number of generations after us, which means we can only take what's absolutely necessary for us to do, because we're going to have to just assume that it's going to perpetuate, because we don't know when it's going to end. We have ideas when the sun's going to blow up, but we don't know how many humans will have existed by then. So this is one of the problems with their approach to this. And while environmental protection in Islam should be applauded as a great step towards Sharia-based environmental protection, it does not justify nor define a sufficiently sophisticated conception of an Islamic obligation to future generations. It's great what they did, but it doesn't come with something practical that can be implemented. There are a few other examples where contemporary Muslim authors claim that Islam includes a concept of obligations to future generations, many arguing similarly to the above, or simply accepting the obligation without providing any argument for them at all. So there is still a need to provide a compelling Sharia-based justification for such obligations and determine the details of what these obligations entail outside of environmental concerns. Because heretofar, they only talk about the environment. Or in some cases they talk about abortion, which really doesn't fall into the idea of obligations to future generations, the way the Western philosophers are looking at it. When assessing new ideas, actions, and circumstances, Muslims consult Islam's sacred doctrine, Aqidah or Usul ad-Din, and praxis, Fiqh or Furu' ad-Din, to ensure that life is in harmony with the doctrine and practice. This assessment is usually performed by scholars who have been trained in traditional corpus of law and methodologies of jurisprudence in Usul al-Fiqh for deriving legal rulings from the Quran and prophetic narratives. Contemporary Sharia scholars will need to assess whether the Sharia recognizes obligations to future generations, what those obligations are, how to balance intergenerational priorities, and what impact, in light of our newfound ability to affect current generations, this concept has on our Sharia discourse. Did you raise your hand? No? Okay. The remainder of this section will attempt to take initial steps in preparing a foundation for Sharia scholars to make this assessment. This will be done by first demonstrating that the Sharia considers obligations to future generations significant and what tools it offers to address them. In doing so, it improves upon prior works such as environmental protection in Islam that I mentioned a minute ago. And this section will discuss several issues specific to the concept of obligations to future generations to serve as a starting point for Sharia experts with the aim of preparing them in their conceptualization of the issue and to provide them with initial starting blocks. Just a side note, at Tabah we tend to write papers and we try to inform ulama and Muslim leaders. And this one in particular, I was addressing it to ulama like Shaykh Ali Guma. And so all I wanted to do was introduce them to the concept, give them a framework, some building blocks to start with, and then for them to correct it, extend it, and all of that. So this isn't going to be able to be comprehensive, the final thing. This is a work in progress. It's a tentative answer that inshallah our major scholars will start looking at. Demonstrating that the Sharia accounts for obligations to future generations is important. As mentioned earlier, the ability to handle these obligations is considered a litmus test for ethical series. When I cut this out of the version that you have, in the introduction it talks about how Western philosophers and ethicists consider how we will view future generations as a test for any ethical theory. So when they look at utilitarianism or Kantian deontology or communitarianism, they look at how well obligations to future generations can be handled through those theories. And if the theories don't handle it well, then they consider there to be a problem with the theory that either needs to be fixed or they need to move on to another theory. So if we as Muslims can provide an intelligent, coherent, and rational to them, something that's understandable to them, view of obligations to future generations, then that allows us to sit at the table with people who are discussing this topic. And we might have something to contribute that they don't. As mentioned earlier, the ability to handle these obligations is considered a litmus test for ethical theories. So one test of the Sharia's relevancy today will be its ability to account for such obligations. This section will demonstrate that the overall objectives of the Sharia, maqasid al-Sharia, indicate that future generations of the human species are indeed significant and that current generations do bear obligations towards their welfare. The existence of the human species is included within the ultimate objectives of the Sharia, and preserving its continued existence is considered a necessity in obtaining well-being. Furthermore, the existence of the human species is a necessary condition for carrying out many of the overall objectives of the Sharia. And his Maqasid al-Sharia al-Islamiyya, the late Tunisian scholar Muhammad Tahir ibn Ashur mentions that the overarching purpose of the ethical legal system of Islam is to preserve the order of the world and to regulate the conduct of human beings in it by preventing them from inflicting corruption and destruction upon one another. And he also said that this was to ensure humanity's healthy progress by promoting its well-being and righteousness. And when he writes about the overarching purpose, he keeps focusing on human beings. And this is because a human being is a predominant creature in this world, and the righteousness and the orderly functioning of the world's affairs depend on the righteousness and virtue of human beings. Accordingly, we find that Islam has dealt with setting to right the condition of mankind by tackling the affairs of the world, of both the individual and the community. So the way he looks at it is, if humans put their affairs correctly, according to the Sharia, that everything, all other species, all other beings will also be treated well and justly. So this is why in Maqasid al-Sharia there tends to be a focus on improving the condition and perfecting the condition of human beings. Because the way we view it in Maqasid, if you're a good human being, this requires that you're also good to animals, good to nature, good to the environment, etc. Human beings must exist in order to actually obtain this overarching purpose. Other objectives in the Sharia require the existence of the human species. For example, the idea that the Sharia is suitable for all human beings in all times and places, the preservation and spread of Islam, the protection and protecting the wealth of the Muslim community. Each of these objectives requires the existence of the human species in order for the objective to be both coherent and obtainable. Furthermore, the latter two objectives include a degree of futurity, looking towards the future, and continuity. We find similar things during his discussion, during Ibn Ashur's discussion, on the universal categories which are necessary to preserve in order to obtain well-being. These are known as dururiyat, or necessities. And these include the preservation of human life. Ibn Ashur writes that the preservation of human life, hifth an-nufus, means to protect human lives from being ruined either individually or collectively. And it's important, individually or collectively. Usually when the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh look at this principle, they always focus on an individual, protecting an individual's life. One of the things that Ibn Ashur brings is the protection of humanity in general, human lives. So it's a collective hifth, not an individual hifth. And he says this is because society, or the human world, comprises the individuals of human species, and every single soul has its specific characteristics that are essential for the existence and survival of the human world. It is important to note that Ibn Ashur considers the preservation of life to include the life of the group of individuals, the entire species, a life which spans the generations of its individual members, not just this group of humans here, but humans through the entire world that are here now and in the future, the entire species. So he considers it to be a necessity to protect them all. So the Sharia does consider future generations significant, and it does assert that prior generations have obligations towards later ones, and it is appropriate to examine, since it does assert it, it's appropriate to examine what tools the Sharia offers for thinking about obligations to future generations, and to then move on to specific issues related to the subject. So now that we've established that they're significant, how can we approach them? The Sharia includes several tools which are useful for thinking about issues that are temporally related, including obligations to future generations among them. The most important of those tools falls under the general topic of taking consequences into consideration, which in books like Ash-Shatibi's Muwafaqat is referred to as i'tibar al-ma'alat. Now, according to Muslim jurists, the Sharia is founded upon on the concept of taking consequences into consideration. One of the most fundamental discussions on the topic is found in Ash-Shatibi's Muwafaqat, which includes a section concerning the need for expert jurists, for mujtahids, to reflect on consequences. As Shatibi considers reflecting upon consequences to be a general basis for the topics within the legal methodology of prohibiting anything that has a potential for leading to which is prohibited. This is known as Sad al-Dhara'i'. In Arabic it's nice, 2 words. In English we have to come out with this 10-word monstrosity. And also for juristic preference, which is istihsan, and the consideration of public interest, i'tibar al-masalih. So this idea of i'tibar al-ma'alat, taking consequences into consideration, Ash-Shatibi considers the 3 things I mentioned, Sad al-Dhara'i', istihsan, and i'tibar al-ma'alat, to all fall underneath it. And there's more details about this in the book that you have. Evidence for taking consequences into consideration comes from the Quran and prophetic narrations. For example, Allah Most High says, "And do not abuse those who call upon besides Allah, lest exceeding the limits they should abuse Allah out of ignorance." A retranslation, just the gist of it. Don't say bad things to other people about things they like, because the consequence will be them saying bad things about what you like. So you have this cause-effect relationship, and because we know that it's likely to result in something we don't like, we avoid the thing that would lead to it. So here we have this i'tibar al-ma'alat, taking into consideration the likely cause. And the verse that I mentioned is often listed as evidence for Sad al-Dhara'i'. The Prophet ﷺ prohibited taking on too many acts of devotion out of fear that one would find them difficult to maintain and leave the original devotion in its entirety. There's many other ayat and many other hadiths that are mentioned in here that support the idea of looking at likely consequences and then modifying the hukm of what would arrive to them. Now, however, there are 2 obvious difficulties in applying the current Sharia conception of taking consequences into account to the topic of obligations to future generations. So even though we find Ash-Shatibi is talking about this, and some other scholars like Ibn Ashur talk about taking consequences into account, what they have in their books isn't yet sufficient. The first difficulty is that Ash-Shatibi's discussion and evidence concern consequences that apply to individuals, just one person, and are direct and relatively near in time, whereas obligations to future generations concern consequences which apply to groups and may be indirect, and they may span generations or even be delayed. The things that we do today may not show their negative impact for hundreds of years. Things like global warming, would anyone ever have really thought back when they started burning coal and all of that hundreds of years down the road, we would have saturated the environment's ability to absorb carbon emissions. They wouldn't have thought of that. And when they were burning the stuff in the beginning, not only would they not have thought of it, the consequences wouldn't have been seen for generations. So, there's one of the difficulties with applying Ash-Shatibi's idea, because it applies to individuals, and every example he gives is very close. You have cause and effect following it fairly close. Days at most. It is possible to make a case that the Sharia acknowledges the notion of such obligations by demonstrating reasoning and rulings consistent with the notion, where we have longer time spans. Examples where concern for future generations plays a role can be found in events from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, as well as in the judgments of his companions after him, where an immediate worldly benefit is left for the sake of benefiting future generations in this world or the afterlife. The examples also show far-reaching consequences are significant, and that the rightly guided caliphs did give special consideration to future generations of both Muslims and non-Muslims. The book gives some examples. They're not here. One of the examples we can find, though, is when Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu expanded the Muslim empire into Iraq. Okay, they took all of these farmlands. And typically what would have happened is when you conquer the territory, it's going to be divided as war booty to the conquerors. But Sayyidina Umar said no, because if we divide it now, then there will be nothing left for the people who reside on it and work on it, and there will be nothing left for their children. So this is an example where Sayyidina Umar is looking at what will be the far-reaching consequences. We can also find an example when they gathered the Quran out of fear after the Battle of Ma'una Orchard, where many memorizers of the Quran died during the battle. They were martyred. What they did is they started gathering the Quran, and the reason that was given was that there was fear that the Quran would be forgotten. Forgotten by who? Not by them, by us, that it would never reach us. We can find other examples where the Prophet ﷺ or the Khulafa Rashidin made a decision that cost them efforts for the sake of people much, much later. Anyways, there's things mentioned in the book there for you. The second difficulty, so the first difficulty is that Ash-Shatibi's view applies to individuals and the cause and effect are very close. The second difficulty is that while it makes sense that necessities and needs of the adjacent generation take precedence over the supplementary benefits of the current generation, there must be some point where the existence of a future generation is unlikely enough that its necessities and needs do not take precedence over the current generation's supplementary benefits. It's similar to the case of we've got 40 people in the room, and there's going to be people coming after us, and people coming after them, and people coming after them, right? This takes resources to build, right? And this is not absolutely obligatory, right? What if 1,000 generations from now the resources required for making this remote control would have been at the expense of the existence of some being 1,000 generations down? So for him, these resources for making this would be essential. For me, it's just a luxury to have. Does it matter that it's 1,000 generations down or not? There has to be a point where the survival of far removed generations cannot really significantly impact decisions we make today, because it's so hypothetical and far. So this is another problem that has to be worked out some way. How are we going to weigh the luxuries of this generation versus the needs of generations thousands of years into the future? Does it make sense or not? Okay. However, there are two obvious difficulties. Alright, we got that first. Second. Before consequence consideration, i'tibar al-ma'alat and its various forms can be applied to the topic of obligations to future generations, experts on the methodologies of jurisprudence of usul al-fiqh will need to extend it and its various forms to account for the issues introduced when long-term or delayed consequences are considered significant. It will also be necessary for them to identify the means to which consequences are actually known. Sharia experts need to settle several issues before they can build a viable framework for addressing obligations to future generations. These issues include who owes what obligations, to whom they are owed, what those obligations are, how to decide dilemmas, and how far those obligations extend. Islamic law recognizes two categories of obligations with respect to the number of individuals involved. There's individual or personal obligations. These are known as fard al-ain. And there's communal or collective obligations known as fard al-kifaya. An individual or personal obligation is one which must be fulfilled by the specific individual himself, whereas a communal or collective obligation is one which must be fulfilled by a sufficient number of individuals in order to lift responsibility from all other legally responsible members of the group. These are the ABCs of usul al-fiqh that all of the students here should have the top of their head at all times. It seems that obligations to future generations fit well within the category of communal obligations, since the various individual obligations owed to future generations can be fulfilled by individuals or segments of the total population, and do not require active participation from each individual member of the entire group. So my suggestion is we look at it as group obligations, not an individual obligation. You are not required to make sure for the welfare of the next generation and so on. No individual can be burdened with that responsibility, but we as a collective, as humanity or as the ummah, we're going to have to bear the burden together. It is necessary to define the scope to whom these obligations are owed. Do the obligations to future generations include obligations to all types of creatures, including dolphins and spiders, to all humans, or just some humans? According to Ibn Ashur's various definitions of the ultimate objective of the Sharia, it is sufficient to concentrate on the fulfillment of our obligations to future generations of humans. Oh, I skipped something. Which human beings? Just Muslims? كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ وُلِدَ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ. So every person who's going to be born is born in the primordial state of being a Muslim. So what happens afterwards might remove them from legal significance. Might. Not necessarily, but might. But when it comes to people who don't exist yet, we're going to have to consider them all Muslims. Because of this, we have to consider them Muslims. So who do we owe them to if we're talking about the future? Every potential human being. And it doesn't matter whether they're born in a population that tends to be mainly non-Muslim. It doesn't matter. We're going to have to consider them all significant. And according to Ibn Ashur's various definitions of the ultimate objective of the Sharia, it is sufficient to concentrate on the fulfillment of our obligations to future generations of humans, not dolphins, spiders, cockroaches. We don't have to be cockroaches. Come on, we have to be nice to them too. We don't have to worry about them, since the interest of non-human future generations will be met through fulfilling whatever obligations are owed to future generations of humans. So just as if we today became perfect Muslims, just as that would ensure that our treatment of everything around us would be just great, we, according to this, by looking at the needs of the future generations of humans and ensuring that they get everything that they're going to need, all of our obligations towards them, with that we will get the benefits for the non-human beings also. And remember, we're Allah's Khalifa, we're His steward here, so we have a responsibility to everything that's in the created world. While most discussions of obligations to future generations occur within the context of economics, the environment, and sustainability, many Western ethicists argue that the content of these obligations include things such as institutions, knowledge and culture, as well as physical resources. Many theories of obligations to future generations have difficulty identifying specific content for these obligations, since interest, values, and tastes vary from people to people and age to age. So for example, if you wanted to think about what would you want to give to the next generation? Oh, let's give them iPhones. Because that's really, really important. What do you think the next generation is going to want to pass on? I doubt it's going to be iPhones. There's going to be something else they value. So a problem with identifying what we would owe to future generations is that their tastes are going to change. So how could we know today what people 500 years from now will value? It's always going to be varying. So how could we plan today? This is a major problem. Identifying specific obligations is a prerequisite to fulfilling them to future generations. And this is an area where a lot of the current theories about obligations to future generations have difficulty. They can't identify things that need to be passed on throughout time. Several potential obligations to future generations can be found within the general categories of benefits the Sharia considers necessary to preserve, and amongst the individual objectives of the Sharia, since both embody that which the Sharia values for all time. So if this is what Allah tells us we should value, and we know this is going to be constant throughout time, here's a possibility of the things we would want to be passing down for Muslims 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 1,500 years from now. Inshallah, we haven't exhausted the resources and killed ourselves 3,000 years from now. A basic list of necessities includes the preservation of religion, life, the intellect, property, and lineage or progeny. If we think of these in terms of future generations, we can rephrase this list as obligations to preserve Islam and to safeguard possibilities for life, the intellect, wealth, and reproduction. While this list does give us something, it does not add anything lacking in the writings of Western ethicists other than the preservation of Islam, because it's not of interest to them, right? Nor does it give us anything resembling specific obligations. Furthermore, it runs the risk of reducing Sharia-based obligations to a triviality. And Justice Gaba, who's one of the ethicists who wrote about this subject in the 80s, said, when he was writing about environmental obligations, he said, quote, "If such obligations ignore the quality of life and become merely an obligation to ensure a world in which humans are capable of existing, then surely the obligation has been reduced to a triviality. If all we do is sustain the possibility of life, what have we really given them? They're going to complain to us, and they're going to make dua against us for giving them a wretched life. So whatever obligation to future generations we have, it has to go above ensuring bare minimums. We have to put them in a situation where they thrive, because otherwise it's a wasted obligation." Something of more substance and practical value can be found among the overall objectives of the Sharia, as these objectives are timeless and immutable, and their attainment leads to the greatest possible well-being for all of creation. Not just humans, but for dogs, cats, spiders, dolphins, you name it. As mentioned earlier, the overall objectives of the Islamic legislation are the meanings and inner aspects of wisdom created by the lawgiver, which can be discerned in most or all of the areas to which Islam as a whole applies, such that they can be seen not to apply exclusively to a particular type of ruling. So these are general themes that we see in the Sharia. Ibn Ashur states that the overall objectives of the Sharia are built upon mankind's primordial state, the fitrah, and that the ultimate objective of human action, the tashri'ah, is the preservation of the order of the world and the regulation of human conduct in a manner that protects it from inflicting harm and destruction upon one another, as I said earlier. Ibn Ashur mentions many general objectives covering a wide range of issues, as well as objectives related to specific issues, such as interpersonal relationships, financial transactions, religious affairs, justice, and retribution, and these are covered at a little bit of length in the paper. But there's nothing really special that you wouldn't get if you were looking elsewhere, looking at other theories. But there's more content there than a lot of the other theories provide alone. So now, here I would like to concentrate on two other objectives and a third issue, as well as all provide obligations to future generations that are specific to Islam. So these are the spreading and implementation of the Sharia, preserving the wealth of the Islamic community, and finally a note about resources and sustainability. One of the highest objectives of the Sharia is that it be spread. Why do we have Islam? Because Allah wants us to do something, right? Just us in this room? No, He wants it spread to the rest of mankind also. So this is seen as one of the big overall objectives. This objective is closely followed by the objectives that it be implemented, applied and preserved. Its implementation and applications are assisted by the important objectives of disseminating Islamic knowledge and increasing its scholars and teachers. The preservation and spread of the Sharia requires removing everything that undermines the certain and definitive foundations of the religion, defending Islam's reputation, protecting its territory, and by supplying and maintaining the means for present and future generations to learn Islam. It also includes preventing fragmentation of the community, protecting religion from disappearing, protecting Muslim sovereignty and lands, protecting the two sacred sanctuaries of Mecca and Medina from falling under non-Muslim control, protecting the Quran from disappearance or distortion via the disappearance of those who have memorized it or its written copies, protecting the knowledge of the Sunnah from introduction of fabricated reports, and anything else whose goodness or evil affects the whole Muslim community or any of its members. This is straight out of the things that Ibn Ashur is mentioning in Maqasid al-Sharia. The application of Sharia within the Islamic community requires the existence of a system of Islamic governance, which is comprised of rulers, judges, advisors for legal issues, police, and market regulators. How they actually exist is another issue that is being hotly debated right now, especially in post-Arab Spring Egypt, about how is the state going to be, what's allowed, what isn't. It's a real exciting area for people who are into Islamic governance. Now, muftis and other Sharia experts who influence practice and policy will need to take into account how their opinions affect future generations, particularly when responding to temporary exigencies. A succeeding generation will inherit the social ills of the previous generation and excusing current ills or preventing them from being rectified means that the problems will increase and eventually become accepted as norms. So if we get used to doing bad things today, the next generation, our children, are going to see us doing it. And right now we feel shame by doing it, but they're going to look at us and say, aha, mommy and daddy do it, so it must be okay. And so what we considered shameful, they considered normal, and then it keeps going. So our actions today, if we don't stop them and rectify them, mean that the next generation of Muslims is going to inherit an Islamic society that is worse than the one that we have right now. While the Sharia is built upon mercy and ease, this mercy and ease are manifested in that individual rulings are easy with respect to the most common situations, and difficult rulings are eased in light of hardships experienced by individuals or the Islamic community at large, and individual rulings are built upon wisdom, discernible underlying causes, on ilm, consistency and clear delineation. The combined means of manifesting mercy and ease leave legally responsible individuals without any excuse for failing to abide by its rules. While the Sharia acknowledges mercy and ease, it is always within limits which do not lead to circumventing or rendering inoperable the overall objectives. Obligations to future generations suggest that Muslim leaders rethink the intergenerational consequences of limiting the very parts of the Sharia which safeguard those objectives and offer corrective measures, and to endeavor in implementing means which gently rectify the shortcomings of our current generation and improve what we pass on to the next. Furthermore, legal maxims concerning necessity, like that necessity renders permissible what otherwise would be impermissible, ad-dururat biha al-mahdhurat, and also necessity is limited to what is needed. These two maxims that we like to quote. We often quote them to justify our generation's actions. We'd say it's darura of the age to do this. Does use of this principle obligate our generation to do something to relieve future generations from the same necessity so that it is not passed on to them? For example, Muslims in a new land with nothing to eat except swine are permitted to eat swine to preserve life. Are they not also required to do something to rectify the situation and ensure that future generations will not suffer the same need? When it comes to something like swine, pork, pig flesh, we automatically, we get upset. We find it disgusting, so we change the situation really fast. Right? But there's other situations that we don't treat it with the same moral aversion. So there are numerous cases where this principle is being invoked, ad-durura, like usury. Okay? Yet rarely is anything significant done to remove the situation which prompted its invocation. So we're living in an age where everyone's saying it's okay for me to do it out of necessity. Ya Habibi, what are you doing to remove the necessity? When I talked about this issue to Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayat a couple years ago, he was very upset to hear that people would say, I have a need, and then they would do nothing to try to remove the need in the future. So that's something that needs to be thought about. Preservation of the Islamic community's wealth, Tharwat al-Ummah, involves preserving its wealth from destruction and from going outside the Islamic community without compensation. And without compensation, it does not necessarily have to be a material compensation. Some wealthy Muslims in some Muslim countries give aid to non-Muslims. And there's an objection, you're wasting the Ummah's money. No, actually in some cases you're buying us good press. You're helping people look at Islam positively, which is a benefit. Sometimes it is to relieve imminent death. For example, the Emirates gave money to, who was it? I think in India there was a flood. I can't remember where. They gave a lot of aid to a non-Muslim nation where there was a massive flood. And some people said, look, you're taking money and you're giving it outside of the Ummah. Well, wait a sec. Preservation of life takes precedence over preservation of wealth. So the idea that we give it without compensation, sometimes we do get compensation back, but it's non-material. security, making people feel better about Islam, improving its image, which it's a necessity. We mentioned it in the previous thing, that preserving Islam's good image is one of the overall objectives that we need to be doing. And sometimes there's a priority over saving money for the ummah. And also preserving individual constituents of that wealth from being destroyed without compensation. Although the overall objectives of the Sharia affirm that owners of private wealth are free to dispose of their wealth as they see fit, an exception is made for wealth which is needed by a segment of the Islamic community. And here it's not wanted, but it's need. Their existence depends upon it. Such as foodstuffs and materials needed to defend the community. Even though such properties remain private wealth, the Sharia's conception of economic justice requires its disposal be within the boundaries of obtaining public interest and warding off public misfortunes. Protecting the wealth of the Islamic community for future generations will require that we assess the habits of the current generation. So notice we talked about inside a generation. If someone has accumulated a huge amount of wealth, this is private property. But if there is a large segment of the Muslim community that is on the verge of destruction, the authorities can transfer some of his wealth to them out of the need of keeping them alive. They need to stay alive more than that guy needs his superfluous wealth. That's within a generation. So what about across generations? We have stuff today, people down the line may need it. So protecting the wealth of the Islamic community for future generations will require that we assess the habits of a current generation. When a cultural habit is found to include a significant harm for the Islamic community, it becomes necessary to evaluate the habit according to the Sharia worldview to determine whether it should be considered unlawful. Habits which involve resource consumption or affect the environment will have an impact on future generations, since these habits do not only influence what future generations can do, but also influence the possibility of their very existence. So in the case of, we have 40 people here, we have 100 units of food, we have people coming after us, let's consume all 100, that means no one else can come, right? So what we decide today not only determines the lifestyle of next generations, the quality of life, it also affects whether or not they can even exist. Clear? Or okay. Such an assessment is in line with the overall principle of affirming good habits and changing bad habits, which is mentioned in Ibn Ashur, Sunnat al-Taghyir, changing things, and Sunnat al-Taqrir, the Sunnah of affirming things. And the Sharia's definition of economic justice, and so provides a means to protecting the wealth of the Islamic community, which is a duty incumbent upon those responsible for looking after the affairs of the Islamic community. In particular, there is a pressing need to assess the current generation's preoccupation with the acquisition of disposable consumer goods and services, which not only removes wealth from the Islamic community, but also reduces the resources that will be available to future generations, changing the environment that will be passed down to them. Some obligations to future generations concern resources which are non-renewable, difficult to renew at a pace commensurate to their depletion, or cannot be sustained if their quantity drops below a particular threshold. It is important to ensure that each generation preserves what is owed to those of the future, since securing and protecting the prerequisites for life are an essential part of a viable framework of obligations to future generations. In extreme cases involving non-renewable resources, or where depletion exceeds the rate of renewal, it will be necessary to determine how far these obligations to future generations extend, so we can determine how much we must save for later generations. Knowing how much to save is dependent upon knowing something about the population of each generation to whom one owes obligations, and problems with this have already been discussed during the presentation on Muslim authors, and once or twice I brought it up also. Nevertheless, in spite of all of these difficulties, in cases involving non-renewable resources or where consumption exceeds production, we must weigh our obligations to future generations against the wants and luxuries of the current generation. This requires that we have a method covering how various harms and benefits will be ranked, measured, and prioritized, as well as guidelines for public policy and enforcement. We need ways to deal with dilemmas. While literature on sustainability, sustainable development, and food security do address many of these issues, the scope here must be expanded, since a Sharia-based obligation to future generations must include Islamic knowledge and institutions particular to Islam. And furthermore, an Islamic obligation to future generations must turn to the Sharia as a basis for how the various harms and benefits will be ranked, measured, and prioritized, and for its guidelines for public policy enforcement. Something to notice here is that Islam looks at benefits of the dunya and the akhirah. So in both this life and the next, whereas the ethical frameworks that are being used in philosophy, they're only concerned with this world. There are things where the benefits in the akhirah is going to outweigh any benefit you could get here. And so this is something we're going to have to prioritize and evaluate. Once we have a clear understanding of Sharia-based obligations to future generations, Sharia legal specialists will be able to use classical models like a Shatibi's consideration of consequences that's in a muwafaqat, which we mentioned earlier, to develop guidelines for muftis, policymakers, and individual Muslims to ensure that we fulfill our obligations to future generations. This paper introduced the concept of ethical obligations to future generations, a concept which has grown in importance and sophistication since the 1970s. The first section of the paper defined the concept and explained its importance to ethicists and policymakers. The second section provided a survey of how contemporary Muslim authors have approached obligations to future generations. Unfortunately, none of them offered a Sharia-based conception that provided practical solutions or was capable of competing with contemporary reasoning in the international marketplace of ideas. The third section attempted to address this need by demonstrating that obligations to future generations exist within the overall objectives of the Sharia, and then presenting a potential foundation for a Sharia-based framework for thinking about such obligations. This framework used the overall objectives of the Sharia to define the various values, knowledge, and culture that must be passed on. And whereas Western conceptions of these obligations have difficulty identifying interests on the grounds that values and interests change from generation to generation, the overall objectives of the Sharia are constant and immutable. Sharia experts can further develop this framework into a viable alternative to Western models that can be used in a manner harmonious to the Sharia and pleasing to Allah Most High, and Allah knows best.